Westminster Abbey is one of the most important religious buildings in the United Kingdom. An early church is thought to have existed on the site in the 7th century, and the location was used by Benedictine monks, centuries before the existing abbey was founded. Around 3,500 people are buried at the abbey, at least 16 monarchs, 8 prime ministers, poets, scientists, actors, as well as the unknown warrior. Westminster Abbey is said to be rife with paranormal activity. If you visit the cloisters of Westminster Abbey, particularly between 5 and 6 p.m, you might be able to see the Abbey's most famous ghost, Father Benedictus. His appearance is rather distinct. He is seen as a solid figure, around 6 feet tall, quite gaunt, and with a pale complexion. Witnesses have described his deep-set, large brown eyes, his hooked nose, and a bald head. His apparition is so lifelike that often people are unaware that they are indeed looking at a ghost, until they notice that he is standing around 1.5 inches above the stone floor, possibly because the floors have either been lowered or simply worn away over the centuries. Some people say he's even been helpful, pointing lost visitors towards the exits at closing time. He was witnessed in 1900 by 2 friends who saw him one Saturday afternoon. One of the visitors felt she was being watched. When she turned around, she reported that he was standing with his hands hidden in the sleeves of his habit and his cowl half back from his head. He then swept the assembly with a very contemptuous glance and then looked straight at me again. He was witnessed for around 25 minutes before disappearing through a wall. In 1932, Father Benedictus was witnessed by 3 visitors who observed his feet above the ground. He apparently spoke to one of the guests in language described as Elizabethan English, where he declared that he was killed in the reign of Henry VIII. He was also observed the night before the wedding of Elizabeth Bowes Lyon to the Duke of York, who later became King George VI, in April 1923. He was witnessed kneeling at the high altar, which was already prepared for the wedding the next morning. So solid was his appearance that the closed church was searched in the belief that someone had been locked in. Nobody was discovered. One autumn night in 1970, a policeman on duty outside of the Abbey witnessed a man wearing robes running past him towards the closed Abbey and disappear through the locked west door. In a state of shock, the officer walked towards the entrance to investigate this mysterious event. He felt a sudden tap on his shoulder and turned to see a procession of men walking silently in pairs, heads bowed, wearing black robes, heading towards the entrance. Thinking his eyes were being ridiculous, he followed the men, who again disappeared through the closed doors. He inspected the door and was overwhelmed by the sound of sweet and plaintive music from inside the Abbey. Hearing a noise behind him, momentarily he turned his back to the Abbey, and when he turned back, the Abbey was completely silent. The same procession, it seems, was witnessed many centuries earlier by poet, artist and mystic William Blake. Between 1772 and 1779, Blake was an apprentice engraver, and he was sent to sketch images from several Gothic buildings, including Westminster Abbey. During one of his visits, he had a vision of a procession of monks and priests moving through the aisles, surrounded by the sound of magnificent organ recital and choir song. The deanery of Westminster Abbey is said to be haunted by the ghost of John Bradshaw, who is notable for his role as the President of the High Court of Justice during the controversial trial of King Charles I. It seems there's a quite specific reason for his restless, wandering soul. Bradshaw had studied law in London, and in April 1627 he was called to the bar at Gray's Inn. In December 1648, after years of bloody feuding between the parliamentarians and the royalist forces in the English civil wars, the 46 MPs in the Rump Parliament voted, and a majority of 26 decided to place the king on trial. On the 20th of January 1649, the trial of King Charles I began. Famously, Charles believed his divine right as king meant the trial was illegal. No court had jurisdiction over a monarch. On the 27th of January, Bradshaw, dressed in scarlet robes and in a speech lasting 40 minutes, declared the king guilty as a tyrant, traitor, murderer, and a public enemy. The king sought to speak. Bradshaw declined to allow this. Under English law, a condemned prisoner was regarded as no longer alive and therefore did not have the right to speak, and Bradshaw abided by this tradition. King Charles I was beheaded on the 30th of January 1649. Bradshaw died on the 31st of October 1659, and like Cromwell, who had died in 1658, he was buried in Westminster Abbey. However, this was not to be his final resting place. King Charles II claimed the throne during the Restoration in 1660. On the 12th anniversary of Charles I's execution, Bradshaw, Cromwell, and Henry Urton, all who had died of natural causes, were ordered to be exhumed from Westminster Abbey and executed posthumously at the gallows at Tyburn. Bradshaw's body had not been embalmed. Apparently it was green and stank. They were hanged until sunset, then decapitated, with their heads being placed on spikes at Westminster Hall. Samuel Pepys wrote that he saw the heads there in February. Their bodies were buried beneath the gallows. Bradshaw lived at the deanery temporarily, and his apparition is said to appear in the triforium at the southwest end of the abbey. He appears sometimes in scarlet robes, as a solid apparition on the anniversary of the king's execution. He is also heard as heavy footsteps pacing through the nearby passage and on the stairs. His apparition has been seen in Henry VII's Lady Chapel, where he looks for his wife, Mary, in the location of their original burial together. She was also exhumed from Westminster Abbey, and along with the remains of other parliamentarians, reburied in a common pit at St Margaret's Church, Westminster. The most moving ghost at Westminster Abbey is said to be that of a First World War soldier who haunts the vicinity of the grave of the unknown warrior, which is located at the western end of the nave. The unknown warrior was given a full state funeral on Armistice Day, the 11th of November, 1920, at the same time that the tomb of the unknown soldier was being interred at the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, shortly after the unveiling of the cenotaph in Whitehall. The grave was filled with earth transported from France and was covered with a simple gravestone. The beautiful slab of black Belgian marble we see today was added in 1921. Its inscription was composed by the Dean of Westminster and was engraved with brass from melted down ammunition. The phantom soldier appears occasionally, standing around 5 feet from the grave, wearing the mud-stained khaki uniform of an infantryman. His head is bowed in silence, and he doesn't wear a helmet or a cap. Sometimes he is seen with his hands in prayer position, other times his arms are outstretched, as if pleading for help or showing desperation. He is silent, although he has been witnessed trying to speak. It is easy to assume that he is the spirit of the unknown warrior, but he could be a brother, a fellow serviceman. It will remain a mystery. The legend of Westminster Abbey's consecration is ghostly or perhaps spiritual in itself. During the 6th century, the area of Westminster as we know it today was named Thorney Island, a small flat sandbank flanked by 2 arms of the Tyburn stream as it flowed into the River Thames. Legend tells of a fisherman casting his nets in the Thames as the sun was setting, but sadly the nets remained empty. He looked to the Lambeth shore, where a figure, an elderly man dressed like a monk, asked to be taken across the river to Thorney Island. The fisherman obliged, and on reaching the bank, the quiet stranger implored him to wait in the boat. He stepped out onto the bank and disappeared into the brambles. Moments later, the dark skies were illuminated spectacularly by golden light, choirs of angels, and the sounds of heavenly singing. The mysterious stranger emerged and requested the shocked fisherman to return him to the Lambeth bank of the river. As they reached the bank, the fisherman asked what he had just witnessed. It was then that the stranger revealed that he was St. Peter, keeper of the keys of heaven, and that he had just consecrated the site. St. Peter told the fisherman to cast his nets the following day and predicted he'd catch an enormous haul of salmon. He told the man to visit the Bishop of London and present him with a fish to prove what he had witnessed. Some say this was the origin of the annual tithe of the salmon given to the abbey by the fishermen of the River Thames. Each year, at the St. Peter's dinner in June, the fishmongers present a salmon to the dean and chapter to celebrate the legendary founding of the first abbey by St. Peter. There are those who believe this story was invented by the monks to add to the abbey's status, but Westminster Abbey's former name was the Collegiate Church of St. Peter at Westminster, and many of its banners include the crossed gold keys symbolising St. Peter. In 1303, thieves broke into the treasure house and managed to escape with significant amounts of jewels and gold. Richard Pudlicott, a wool merchant who had fallen on hard times, along with his accomplices, were blamed for the theft. Valuable items were turning up in pawn shops, brothels, and even on the banks of the River Thames. Much of the haul was recaptured from a hasty burial site in the middle of the Great Cloister. It is thought that around 12 thieves were hanged, including Richard, who made a false confession before his execution. He declared that he was the only one responsible for the crime, saving many of the clergy who were acting as his inside accomplices. Once hanged, his body was flayed, and his skin was said to be nailed to the door in the passage leading to the chapter house, as a deterrent to anyone who might be tempted to steal from the abbey. This is Britain's oldest door, dating back to the 1050s, during the reign of Edward the Confessor, and the door is made from 5 vertical oak panels. For centuries, it was assumed that the skin was indeed human, as it would have provided a smooth surface for decorative paint. In 2005, the myth was debunked. English Heritage carried out a range of tests and discovered that the skin was in fact cowhide, and it still adheres to the door even to this day. Some believe that it was during this act of sacrilege that Father Benedictus was stabbed. However, there are no official records of this. There is a myth regarding the death of King Henry IV. Dating back to the 14th century, the Jerusalem Chamber is a room in what used to be the medieval house of the abbots of Westminster. This beautiful room, with its wooden panels and tapestries, escaped bomb damage in World War II and is now a private room in the deanery. The coffins of Sir Isaac Newton, Joseph Addison and William Congreve were held here before their funerals inside the abbey. In March 1413, King Henry IV was preparing for a crusade to the Holy Land. A few weeks before, a fortune teller had prophesied that he would die in Jerusalem, which he believed to mean the great sacred city. Sadly, he never made the journey. Whilst praying at St. Edward's shrine inside the abbey, he collapsed and was taken ill, apparently with a stroke. He was brought to the abbot's house and placed by the fire, where he gained consciousness. King Henry asked where he was and was told Jerusalem. It is said that at that moment the king realised he was going to die, and the Jerusalem prophecy had indeed come true.